Hello and a very warm welcome. Thank you for joining me. You're looking at the title page of a book-length poem published anonymously in 1594 called Willobie His Avisa. This has been of considerable interest to Shakespearean scholars over the years because in a prefatory poem we have the passing line, "And Shakespeare paints poor Lucrece rape." This is interesting, really not for what it says, but for the fact that it is the first mention of William Shakespeare as a literary figure by a third party. The name crops up underneath the dedication to Venus and Adonis in 1593, underneath the dedication in 1594 to Lucrece, and this is the third time it happens, but as I say, the first time that the third party person has mentioned it, and it's put Shake-Spear, indicating really that it's a pseudonym, that it relates to the patron goddess, Pallas Minerva, the goddess of playwrights, who was born shaking a spear from the head of Zeus. Shakespeare, or Shakspeare of Stratford, of course, never used that hyphen in any of his undertakings, and nor did any of his family or friends. Shake-Spear, very much looking like a pseudonym. I'll come back to that in a future part. Also in this poem we have quite a long dialogue section between two people identified only as WS, the initials, and the initials HW. Now, why this has been of great interest, you'll remember in the sonnets, known as Shakespeare's Sonnets by William Shakespeare, he shares a mistress with the fair youth, who is very often identified as Henry Willobie H.W., and W.S. therefore being William Shakespeare. The coincidence seems too much to bear. Not only that, in The Passionate Pilgrim, published possibly for the second time in 1599, possibly for the first, by William Shakespeare, we have William Shakespeare advising on how to seduce women using very much the same language as is used here. So it seems that the author of Willobie His Avisa is deliberately tilting at William Shakespeare and Henry Willobie, saying that they are involved with the same mistress, which is the scenario in the sonnets. Okay, what is it about this particular book that is interesting? If you read it from cover to cover, you'll realize it's based on an extremely famous story. Avisa is a married woman who has to rebuff endless suitors who come to try and seduce her. This is the story of Penelope. The Greek myth, Penelope, you'll remember, is married to Ulysses, who goes off on his wanderings for 20 or so years, and Penelope is besieged by sexually excited suitors who come singing poems, playing music, offering her gifts in order to seduce her. And she says, well, I tell you what, I'll choose one of you when I've finished my weaving, and then deliberately doesn't finish it. This is the story that is told in Willobie His Avisa. Now already people who have, those among you who have watched the videos I've been putting online will know that there's a great scandal going on exactly at this time in the mid-1590s, which involves Penelope Rich, Henry Willobie, initials HW, and Edward de Vere, who is writing under the name William Shakespeare, WS. So straight away, I think anyone who's seen some of those, and I've listed their titles to the left there, will know that this book, Willobie His Avisa, must be about that scandal. If you haven't seen those, please do so, because corroboration is the key to all of this. It's the key to the authorship mystery itself. There's no one piece of paper you can wave and say, there you go, end of. But there's so much corroboration that you can be absolutely certain when one's dug out the truth from the centre of the earth. And the truth here, of course, involves this Penelope Rich scandal. This book is about it. It was known it was about it, and because it was banned. That's one very good piece of evidence that this was no ordinary pulpit sermon about chastity. John Whitgift, Archbishop of Canterbury, and Richard Bancroft, Bishop of London, had between them enormous power over what was printed and what was to be banned. And in 1599 they put out a list of works which they desired to be destroyed, and brought in and destroyed by the Stationers' Company. Willobie was on that list. On June the 4th, 1599, the bishops ordered that it be taken in and burnt, and they also ordered that no satires or epigrams be printed hereafter. So it's fairly obvious that the bishops understood that this work was scurrilous, highly libelous, and was libelling some very important people and needed to be destroyed, despite what is written on the title page. describing the work as the true picture of a modest maid and of a chaste and constant wife, even quoting the Bible. A virtuous woman is the crown of her husband, but she that maketh him ashamed is as corruption in his bones, from the book of Proverbs. Well, clearly the bishops weren't taken in, and they didn't see this as a goody-goody Puritan pulpit sermon. They understood perfectly well that it was a vile slander and a satire, a libel on someone contemporary. In fact, people at the time were deeply aware of the problem, and a rebuttal came out almost as soon as Avisa was published, and it's called Penelope's Complaint, clearly realizing that someone called Penelope was being slandered by it. Peter Kolss is said to be the author. I think that's actually a pseudonym, and in the prefatory material of Penelope's Complaint he bangs on about the ghastliness of the pamphlet Avisa, which he says is about a vainglorious Avisa seeking to slander her superiors. Samuel Daniel is represented by the initials SD on top of a poem written in Latin, but has many times been translated into verse into English. This poem of Samuel Daniel goes on and on and on, saying, don't think that Avisa in Willobie His Avisa, don't think that that represents Penelope. It doesn't, I absolutely assure you. Here's a little bit of the translation of that. Why seeks she titles, boasts she riches? Why, Avisa? Is she with Penelope to vie? Penelope, renowned, revered, true to her own. Avisa, an unknown woman from a place unknown. Long live Penelope and flourish fair. Avisa may never with Penelope compare. That's just a small part. He goes on and on and on, trying to rip apart the idea that Avisa and Penelope are one and the same. What's particularly interesting about this is that Samuel Daniel, the famous poet, at the time when he wrote this, was under the patronage of Charles Blount. And Charles Blount was the then boyfriend of Penelope Rich. Penelope Rich was married to Lord Rich, but she was having this affair with Charles Blount. So it very much seems that Blount and Penelope put Samuel Daniel up to refuting Avisa and saying it has nothing whatsoever to do with Penelope. When Penelope's Complaint was published, it obviously was rebutted again by the Avisa publishers, and in a new edition of Avisa we hear Peter Kolss, that's the supposed author of Penelope's Complaint, Peter Kolss hath been carried away with this stream of misconceived folly. The author of Avisa intended neither the description or praise of any particular woman, nor the naming or ciphering of any particular man. Ha ha ha, this is completely contradicting what was written actually in the original preface to Avisa. Therefore Peter Kolss hath offered manifest injury to some whom his private fancy hath secretly framed in conceit. Well, we think we know who he's offered manifest injury to, and that is, of course, Penelope Rich and her various entourage. So we can see there was a great fuss about this book. Now, I've divided the presentation on this book into various parts. This is the first one, and in this one I'm going to deal solely with this title page. I'm not going to open the book, we're just going to look at the title page and see how much it tells us about the contents of this book and about the libel that it contains. First of all, notice that it is called Avisa. Well, I've told you it's based on the mythological story of Penelope. Why, for heaven's sake, don't you just call it Penelope? Venus and Adonis is called Venus and Adonis. Why not Penelope? Well, I think the answer is pretty obvious. If you call it Penelope, it's even more in her face. The injury to her is even more obvious. So why, in that case, call it Avisa? Well, avis in Latin is a bird, and I think some of you who have been following my presentations will know already that a Penelope is a turkey hen. That's a guinea fowl. Actually, Penelope was called something like Arnea or something originally, but called herself Penelope after the Penelope bird, Penelope avis. Actually, in the same dictionary, funnily enough, I've discovered that a gannet is also defined as a bird, Penelope avis. Well, it doesn't really matter which bird is in mind, because Penelope means a bird and Avisa comes from the Latin meaning a bird. So you've got quite a big clue there. If we're looking for clues, then what is the great scandal about that people are being libelled over? I think the pretty obvious when you looked at these two sentences. It's a picture of a modest maid, ha ha ha, the chaste and constant wife, as if. A virtuous woman is the crown of her husband, but if she maketh him ashamed is as corruption in his bones. So probably the scandal is about a married woman sleeping around with someone else. It becomes even more obvious when you look at the top of the page and you see a stag with its horns, as everybody in those days would have known very well. The horns are a symbol of cuckoldry. A cuckold is a man whose wife is sleeping with someone else, who's said to grow horns. So if this is about Penelope Rich, her husband was called Robert Rich, and one might wonder whether that stag up there is representing Robert Rich, the cuckold. Now, I'm going to look at this through the lens of something we've already done. I hope many of you have seen a presentation I put online which is called John Gerard Knew. It's worth seeing if you haven't, but in that we looked at this title page and I showed that there's great significance in the fact that this fellow is looking across at that fellow while pointing at the coat of arms. That's the coat of arms of this man over here, so he's actually identifying him as John Gerard, the author. And if you look at John Gerard, you see he's looking directly at us. He's looking at the reader because he is the author. He's addressing the reader. Equally, this man down here is turning away. In fact, he's hiding himself. He is the concealed poet, Edward de Vere, Earl of Oxford, who is dressed as Apollo and holding symbols identifying him as Shakespeare. As I say, I don't want to go into this really now. Please look at John Gerard Knew if you haven't seen it. But I bring it up because I want to apply exactly the same techniques now to Willobie His Avisa's title page. What we're going to do is look at where the figures on this page are looking and pointing and see what significance lies behind that. Let's start in the top left corner with this little cherub. Cherub, a cupid, obviously is a symbol of erotic love. Well, you'll see that his left arm is draped over the antler, and of course we know that an antler is, as we know, a symbol of cuckoldry. So left arm over the cuckold symbol, and then he seems to be looking, perhaps in reproach, at this figure and pointing, no doubt accusatory, to this figure. If you look at the opposite, we see exactly the same thing. We see a cherub, a cupid, that's a symbol of erotic love. This time the right arm is draped over the horn, which is the symbol of a cuckold, and pointing perhaps in an accusatory way at this figure and looking maybe with reproach on this figure. So straight away we see a connection between the cuckold and the two figures underneath. And now we have to ask ourselves, are these cherubs deliberately pointing, deliberately staring, deliberately accusing, because the two figures to left and right are in somehow representing the two figures who have cuckolded the central stag. Let's have a closer look at the two figures. I think it's the only way to get to the bottom of this and work out who they are. Starting with the one on the left, a plumed helmet, a shield worn on the back, a breastplate, armory, a scroll indicating something to do with writing, literature, an owl, a bit of olive branch, and a pomegranate. Actually, that's quite easy from all those things to identify. It's this person who also, as you can see, has a plumed helmet, a shield, armor plating, books, that's the equivalent to the scroll, an owl, olive, and pomegranate. And yes, of course, this is Pallas Minerva. Remember how we saw the author of this book says shake-spear. So perhaps is it possible that the author of this book is suggesting a visual allusion between Pallas Minerva, shake-spear, and this figure here on the left. Many of you who have studied Oxfordian matters will be very aware that Gabriel Harvey, who was a contemporary at the time, related or connected Oxford to Pallas Minerva. In fact, he said that Oxford's heart and mind is instructed by Pallas Minerva. Oxford lies hidden in Minerva's right hand, says Gabriel Harvey. He also, addressing Oxford, says, "Your will shakes spears," a very clear allusion to Pallas Minerva, the spear shaker, patron saint of theatre. Vultus tella vibrat, was the way he put it in Latin. And James Lee in 1589, talking of Oxford, says that Pallas fills his breast. And very famously, Henry Peacham identifies the Earl of Oxford as the British Minerva. Tibi nom de Vere. Your name is de Vere. If you don't know about that, this was in 1612. If you don't know about it, please look at the presentation I put online, which is called Henry Knew. Now, I know for some of you it's a little bit annoying and confusing, because I put out a lot of presentations saying that the Earl of Oxford is identified as Apollo. Well, yes, and also as the Shake-Spear, as Pallas Minerva. One just has to live with the fact that people in those days were rather obsessed with Greek mythology, and sometimes their living people were connected with more than one of the Greek myths. Okay, let's look at the figure on the other side. It's actually much easier to identify, and we can do it with just two identifications. That's the crescent moon crown on her head and the quiver full of arrows strapped to her back. Those two alone tell us very simply that she is the goddess Diana. Those of you who have seen a presentation I put up, sorry to keep cross-referring, but it's the only way to get all these corroborations into the mind. Those of you who have seen a presentation I put out about John Weaver New will know that Penelope Rich was identified time and time again by her contemporaries with Diana. Sally Varlow, her biographer, says that she's represented more as Diana even than Stella, because, of course, the Henry Constable sonnets called Diana were all dedicated and addressed to her in 1592. Bartholomew Young praised, and I quote, her the singular knowledge and delight wherewith she entertaineth and embraceth this particular subject of Diana. So Penelope Rich has Monty Miles' Diana is dedicated to her, and the composers Thomas Morley and Charles Tessier both dedicate songs to her as Diana. Also very interesting, actually, there's a poem by Southan called De Vere, all about De Vere, and the very next poem says, to his mistress Diana, so it seems there might be a connection there. So, Diana as Penelope Rich and Pallas Minerva as Shakespeare Oxford. Now, what then, if these identifications are correct, what are they doing? Perhaps it's easier to understand what they're doing if I bring the two images together, and then it becomes quite clear. They're sort of hiding, as it were, underneath a blanket or underneath a sheet. What do lovers do who are not supposed to be found in bed together? They hide under the blanket, and who do they hide from? But they obviously hide from their spouses. In this case, if we look at the full picture, we can see they're hiding from this figure, the one with the antlers, who is the cuckold. Does this cuckold therefore represent Penelope Rich's husband, Robert Rich, Lord Rich? Well, one thing quite interesting you'll notice straight away is he seems to be wearing on his head the crescent moon that is also worn by Penelope Diana down here. This, of course, brings to mind this biblical quotation on the title page. A virtuous woman is the crown of her husband, but she that maketh him ashamed is as corruption in his bones. Sorry to be reading it more than once, but it is obviously very relevant. The crown of Diana Penelope here is the crescent moon. She's given the crown to her husband, but what a backhanded present that is, because of course it is in the shape of horns. She has given him horns, i.e. made him into a cuckold because of her sleeping, presumably, with the character over the other side. Look at that character again. Look at Minerva, representing Shakespeare Oxford. Where is that figure pointing so very clearly with the index finger of the right hand? Pointing at this looks a bit like an anvil, but actually it's the ox's horns, the horns of an ox. Suggesting then that this Minerva figure, Oxford Shake-Spear, is also responsible for the horns of Robert Rich. I say Robert Rich, you may think I'm being a bit a cavalier in my interpretation here, but you'll notice actually that there's not just one stag with horns here, there are actually two on this page. I'm going to make that a bit bigger so you can see it. There it goes. What you're looking at here is a depiction of the mythological story of Diana and Actaeon. So once again we have Diana in this picture. The myth goes that Actaeon was hunting in the forest and he came across Diana bathing naked, and Diana in retribution for this, turned him into a stag. Thus we have, for the second time then, Diana putting horns onto someone, which, as I say, gives the metaphorical view of creating a cuckold. This now happening twice, so Diana is connected twice to two stags, both of which seem to be referring to cuckoldry and her husband. What is the connection then between Penelope Rich, Lord Rich, and two stags? Well, you only have to look at his coat of arms to get the answer to that. You'll see the two supporters on Lord Rich's coat of arms are the stags. This one when he was already Earl of Warwick. He was made Earl of Warwick later, with Lord Rich at the time. But the two stags, obviously very important, with the motto Garde la foi, which means protect the faith, something that is much mocked in Willobie His Avisa. Okay, so we see how Penelope Diana then is connected to the two stags, which seem to indicate her husband, the cuckold. Looking back then at this figure here, we've seen how he points with the index finger on his right hand to the oxen, the horns of the oxen, and look where he seems to be pointing with the index finger of his left. He's pointing down here to that stag, the horned cuckold. So once again, in exactly the same way, this figure is twice connecting, or let's say taking some responsibility for the cuckoldry of the husband. A remarkable bit of clever working going here, because he is also, of course, as we've seen, connected directly to Diana on the other side by virtue of the fact that he's hiding under the same sheet, so he's clearly the lover. There's actually another connection between these two figures, and that appears under their feet. There on both of them you see pomegranates. Now pomegranates are well known to be the symbol of fertility. I leave it to you to decide for yourselves whether you think that the Penelope Rich Diana figure here is actually pregnant. Certainly she's got a rather protruding tummy, and another little clue to that effect is down here. You see what looks like a honeysuckle known as a woodbine. Honeysuckle, also known at the time as Lilium interspinum, which means lily among the thorns, and I'll come to that in a minute. But if you read the old books, herbal books of botany, for instance, Rembert Dodoens or John Gerard, and look to see what they've got to say about honeysuckle, they say it is used by pregnant women to get the delivery of their babies, so it's an inducer for babies. And as I say, it is also known as the lily among the thorns. If you look at its sort of opposite number here, you can see a rose. So we have a rose and a lily, and those of you who have read Shakespeare's sonnet, read Venus and Adonis, will see how time and time again Shakespeare invokes the rose and lily in conjunction with Adonis, the fair youth, who is Henry Rosalie, the rose, the lily, and Henry Rosalie. They're also, of course, symbols of lust and purity. Beneath this we see what looks like two hairs. Actually it's four hairs. If you look very carefully behind each hair there's another one. I hope some of you have seen a presentation I put online called Thomas Porter Knew. In that we see Shakespeare addressed by the lines, "There are as many hairs on Athos as your muse has heirs, your Veres from a rich genetic vein." This is a huge tease at poor old Shakespeare, saying that all his children who are called Veres are in fact the children of Penelope Rich. Do look at that. It's called Henry Porter Knew if you haven't seen it. But I obviously want to ring these hairs here, because there I also remind the viewers that hairs are a symbol of wanton lust and of harlotry, and that's why they're obviously put there for this occasion. So if I join everything you're looking at here that's marked in red with the accusatory pointing and reprobative looks of these cupids at the top, you see that the whole page has been constructed with intricate geometrical precision to tell a story, to reveal a narrative that is underneath the most obvious interpretation. The most obvious interpretation, of course, being that we have Pallas on one side, because Pallas is the goddess of eloquence and writing, and this is a poem, and we have Diana on the other side, because Diana represents chastity, strangely enough. She does, even though she seems to be a goddess of fertility. But now we've looked deeper, and we've seen that underneath this is in fact an awful lot of accusing and suggestion that two real live people, that is to say Penelope Rich and the Earl of Oxford, are somehow in bed together making a cuckold of her husband, who is Lord Rich, and this all has something to do with Henry Rosalie. I hope I haven't made this too complicated. I really try hard to make these presentations as simple as I can, but the Tudor mind is very, very dark and cunning, and sometimes just getting the simplest message out of these things requires quite a complicated and deep gazing at them. But I hope you've enjoyed it. Part 2 of Willobie will be available soon. Please press the button to subscribe and the little bell so you'll get notified when those parts are up. And what we'll be doing then is looking inside the book to get more evidence, not only that Avisa is Penelope, but also, and perhaps most importantly, that Edward de Vere is William Shakespeare. Thank you very much indeed for watching.